Welcome everyone. I'm so glad everyone made it to Why Isn't My Digestion Working Part 2. So we'll recap. I know there were several questions on, do I have to see Part 1 or what's covered in Part 1 versus Part 2. So we'll recap that and talk that everything overlaps, right? It's impossible to divide anything in the body. So we'll talk about that too if there's any confusion. But before we get started, I want to introduce myself. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. My name is Kimsey Self. I'm actually a graduate of NTI. I graduated from the school 5 years ago or so after fast tracking the MNT program. So I finished the 2-year program. Everything kind of lined up beautifully in life, and I was able to finish the 2-year program in 10 months, kind of got in and got out, and then immediately started working. So took this education into the clinical environment, which is almost exclusively my experience. So I've worked for 2 different alternative medicine doctors' offices in that time. It was chiropractic, neurology, and functional medicine. And the second one was more integrated medicine. So very much a 50-50 blend of both alternative and Western approaches. And for both offices, I was hired on to essentially do the same thing, which was develop their nutrition program. So that's exactly what I did. And it was this amazing opportunity to form strategic relationships with lab companies and supplement reps, and then obviously do marketing to help build up and get more clientele to see nutrition. So it was a beautiful experience. I learned so much working in those environments, and then eventually took that to open my own business, which was one of the goals. I got my undergrad in business administration. So starting my own business was something I'd always wanted to do. And that's who I represent today, which is Progressive Health and Wellness. Progressive Health and Wellness is a completely virtual nutrition, wellness, and education company. So I meet with people online, and I created that design for a reason. I didn't want to be bound by geography and how many people I could help. So thankfully, the design is actually working, and I'm working with people kind of all over the United States, and at one point all over the world. So it's been a beautiful opportunity. One of the missions of Progressive is education, right? Education is power. And so I give these presentations regularly, and have started selling webinar versions as well, again, to honor the mission of not being bound by the number of people that I can help, right? So today's topic is, why isn't my digestion working? Part 1 largely covered, if you can divide the GI tract by upper and lower GI, that's conceptually what I was going for here. Keeping in mind, you can't fully and completely do that. However, from a testing point of view, you somewhat can. So part 1 looked at most processes that occur in the stomach, everything from the mouth to the stomach to the small intestine. And we discussed in depth like hypochlorhydria, nutrient deficiencies, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and associated testing for those. Okay. We also covered leaky gut syndrome, gluten sensitivity, things along those lines. Keep in mind, a lot of that is going to overlap into today's class. So if you are listening and I reference part 1, know that it too is available via webinar, and we can coordinate getting that to you by the end of this class or via email. So it is accessible, but nonetheless, that's kind of how these 2 classes are divided. Today, we're still going to talk a little bit about statistics so everybody understands the scope of the matter when it comes to digestive issues. We'll still cover signs and symptoms of digestive dysfunction all along the gastrointestinal tract. And then we're going to really zero in on the colon, specifically stool testing. So there's still going to be references, when I talk about parasitic infections, for example, parasites usually inhabit the small intestines, but you test them via stool. So we'll talk about what to look for, how those are addressed, to give you kind of an example of how things will flow. And then we'll spend a pretty good amount of time on functional testing, specifically stool testing. I know when I was going to school here, we'd learned so much in digestion and detox and clinical nutrition that I got out and was like, one of the first people I worked with, I was like, we need a stool test. And I don't know what I'm doing with it. It's like, I can order it, but I don't know what to look for. And thankfully, most labs have analytical review, and so they'll go through it with you. But stool testing, in my mind, is more of a question of when than if. When you consider that approximately 80% of disease arises in the intestines, stool testing has become extremely routine for me. It just depends on their clinical presentation. If they're presenting with overt GI dysfunction, we'll run it up front. If not so much, if it doesn't seem like as big of a priority, we'll run it towards the back end. But typically, as long as finances and time allow for it, stool testing will be run. You can learn so much about a person by their bowel movements. So we'll talk about what that looks like. And I have a couple of different stool test examples in here, like case studies, that we'll go through and start to identify some of the patterns and connect some of the dots for that too. And then obviously what to do about it, right? How to apply nutrition to this as well. Okay, so looking at statistics, these are looking at specifically irritable bowel syndrome statistics. The reason being is because irritable bowel syndrome really and truly is just a catch-all diagnosis, right? It's just an umbrella and a kind of fancy way of saying you're not pooping right and you have some GI symptoms and we don't know why. So we're going to call it IBS. It's very much, it's kind of like fibromyalgia in that sense. The diagnosis doesn't really mean a whole lot. Fibromyalgia is just this umbrella term for saying you're always tired and you're always in pain. We don't know why, so we're going to call it that. So, I'm sorry. Kind of. I mean, I don't want to, use the term lazy because but to some degree, yes, the process of determining the cause of the issue stops there. So, yeah, similar thing here. A lot of people, IBS is what got me into this program. So I've learned from experience, there's not a whole lot often that can be done from a conventional medicine point of view. Nonetheless, outside of respiratory tract issues and infections, IBS is the second most common cause for doctor's office visits. Keep in mind, 70% of people with irritable bowel syndrome symptoms don't even see doctors. So kind of skewed statistics there. What that's essentially saying is it doesn't mean that it's their normal. Okay. Sorry, my computer things are popping up, so I'm making sure that you guys are still seeing things okay. Okay. So, in other words, the take-home message for statistics regarding irritable bowel syndrome is you will run into almost everyone that you see will have some form of sign or symptom of it, right? It's extremely common. Now, signs and symptoms of overall digestive function. The intestines are essentially one long skin tube that run from one end down to the other. So dysfunction can arise anywhere along the lines, from the mouth all the way down to the rectum. Starting at the top, there's heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, which is basically just chronic heartburn. Prolonged sense of fullness after meals, excessive burping. All three of those are indications of some kind of stomach acid problem. Either most commonly hypochlorhydria, but sometimes hyper. Foul-smelling gas. Guys, your stool and your gas is not supposed to, it's really not supposed to clear rooms, right? I know a lot of people, it's kind of become a joke in modern society, but if people consistently have very foul-smelling gas or very foul-smelling stool, it's not normal. It's typically indicative of some kind of an overgrowth because it's methane or hydrogen, but commonly methane that's being produced in those situations, which can get tracked back to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, archaea overgrowth, things along those lines. Okay. Constipation, diarrhea, bowel movement urgency. This can appear in irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease. I'll talk about the differences between those in just a second. Basically, though, you should be able to hold and control your bowel movements. If it's to the point where you feel the sensation and it's like, oh my gosh, I have to go now, that's indicative of a problem. History of food poisoning, parasitic infection, or candidiasis. Now with the advent of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, I'm hearing, I've had about 2 or 3 clients at this point. Traditionally, food poisoning was always just this acute issue. You got sick for about 24 hours and it really takes it out of you, and then you're fine after that. Had a few people that come in that say, I got food poisoning and that cleared up, but I've had these chronic problems months later, pain, altered stool, bowel movement patterns, things along those lines. So it's possible for that to trigger more of a chronic issue. And we'll talk a little bit about that connection when we talk about biofilms. Okay, stool that is black, clay-colored, floats, or has fatty mucus streaks in it. Black is indicative of upper GI bleeding, like stomach ulcer or small intestinal bleeding. Often looks like coffee grounds, you might have heard. If it's lower GI bleeding in the colon, it will typically appear as blood. Sometimes you can see it. Sometimes it'll just show up in testing as, quote, occult blood, which is essentially kind of it's not necessarily an active issue, but it's showing up in microscopic and measurable amounts within a test. Clay-colored, or if the stool floats, are both indications of steatopyria or fat maldigestion. Clay-colored meaning kind of this grayish, very light color. It's quite obvious. And then mucus or fatty streaks, pretty difficult to determine the difference between mucus and fatty streaks in the stool, but if you're seeing, obvious one of those because they look the same, inflammation, fat maldigestion, oftentimes both. Undigested food in the stool, and many food sensitivities or allergies. Okay, let's take a brief trip down the digestive tract. We talked about the digestive process in depth in part 1. There's 3 phases. To respect time in this class, I'm just going to breeze through these, but I do want to touch on kind of a review for the general anatomy and physiology, the function of digestion, because we're going to talk about that in stool testing when we look at it. So there's 3 phases of digestion. There's the cephalic phase. Cephalic phase starts in the brain first, right? 9 times out of 10, if you ask people where does digestion start, they're going to answer the mouth. Contrary to popular belief, it actually starts in the brain. So simply smelling and anticipating food initiates the digestive process. Here's the thing. That phase alone accounts for 20% of digestion. Another way of looking at that is the inverse. If that phase doesn't happen, digestion's only operating at 80%. So think about all of the times people are driving and eating and working and eating, and they're not really paying attention to the meal, or they weren't necessarily kind of mentally, if you will, prepared to eat the meal. Now you're operating at only 80% because you're not going to release saliva as efficiently. You're not going to release appropriate levels of hydrochloric acid, and then that whole process kind of gets passed on down to the rest of the digestive tract. So that phase is critical. Being present with the meal is critical, in other words, and not eating while stressed is critical, especially if this happens on a consistent basis. Think about, if this is happening, if you're only operating at 80% on a consistent basis, and you're now passing partially digested food down from the stomach into the small intestines, what loves partially digested food? Bacteria. Yeah, bacteria, fungus, these different microbes. So if this is happening frequently, you will eventually end up contributing to these overgrowths because these bacteria, parasites for that matter, fungus, are going to flourish, right? So it becomes a bigger issue. After cephalic phase, there's the gastric phase. I kind of hinted at that. Gastric phase, as the name implies, is when the food hits the stomach. There's almost everything in the body works on a feedback mechanism. So in the gastric phase, it's stimulated when the stomach starts to expand. And the brain senses that and says, oh, okay, there's food in the stomach. Let's continue to release appropriate amounts of hydrochloric acid. So in the gastric phase, now it initiates the chemical and mechanical digestion of food, breaking it down into smaller and smaller subparticles. And then there's the intestinal phase. Same thing, same reflex mechanism. The chemical secretion in the stomach stops when the food starts to be passed on to the duodenum. the first part of the small intestine. Keeping in mind here, going back to the concept that everything acts on a feedback loop, part of the feedback system is when that, it's called chyme at this point, when it's passing from the stomach into the duodenum, it's highly acidic, right? The pH of the stomach is like 1. So there's very few things that are more acidic than the stomach, or stomach acid, I should say. But the stomach has this mucosal lining. It's designed to contain that. The rest of the intestines do not. So what happens when that food is passed into the small intestine, the duodenum senses that acidity and releases the pancreas and the gallbladder release this bile and bicarbonate splash and digestive enzymes to neutralize the acidity and then continue to break down the food. I bring that up because when we start to look at dysfunction, that's one of the areas where it can happen. Okay, so one of the philosophies that I operate by is once you understand normal, identifying dysfunction becomes very easy, right? So what I just discussed is normal. You're eating in a very relaxed environment, you're anticipating the food, you yourself are relaxed, you eat the meal, thoroughly chew the food, swallow, hits the stomach, which is filled with hydrochloric acid, chemically and mechanically start breaking it down, passes on to the duodenum, and elicits, that acid elicits the release of bicarbonate, digestive enzymes, bile. You continue to emulsify fat, break down the food, and then it gets passed on, and you've got, dozens of feet of intestines to absorb everything. That's normal. Think about, though, when that process is hindered even at the cephalic phase. So when I mentioned if people are eating while stressed or not present with the meal, maybe they're taking antacids, maybe they have an H. pylori overgrowth, nutrient deficiencies. I mean, if you don't have zinc, you're not going to produce stomach acid appropriately. So all of these things start to arise at the very beginning, right? Or what if you just don't chew your food enough? All of that then gets passed on down the rest of the tract. So we'll talk about how to identify hypochlorhydria or imbalanced stomach acid, and I'll show you the patterns in the stool testing. I'll show you a specific pattern where somebody fits all of that, right? He was never present with the meal. Great, and he had some other things going on too. But you'll see in his stool test results, there's low hydrochloric acid, there's low pancreatic enzyme output, he's got these bacterial overgrowths. So you start to kind of put all of the pieces of the puzzle together, right? Okay, continuing, I wanted to include some information on IBS versus IBD. That's very confusing for a lot of people, and the terms often overlap. So just to address it, irritable bowel syndrome versus inflammatory bowel disease, they're two completely different things. Irritable bowel syndrome is not considered a disease process. It's considered a functional disorder. What that means is there's typically no gross abnormalities that are associated with it. So one of the go-tos for evaluating, if somebody says, hey, my stomach's always upset, I'm not going to the bathroom right, either I can't go or I can't stop going. Most of the time, gastroenterologists will start with a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, endoscopy is coming from the top down to look at the stomach and sometimes the first part of the small intestine. Colonoscopy is going from the bottom up to look at the colon. And nothing can typically be identified. There might be some slight inflammation in the esophagus or something, but not too much is going to be identified as far as gross abnormalities go. Excuse me. Inflammatory bowel disease, on the other hand, something is identified. This is considered an actual pathological disease state. IBD is, again, it's an umbrella term for many different conditions. The most common that you will have heard of and can possibly see are Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and kind of nondescript colitis, the most common being diverticulitis. Right? Diverticulitis is pretty common. You'll see that come back, or the presence of polyps, for example. You'll see that come back pretty often, especially now that it's recommended for everybody over age 50 to get a colonoscopy. a lot of people will say, oh yeah, my doctor says that I have diverticulitis, but I'm just supposed to avoid seeds. Like, no, you did not get an inflamed colon by eating seeds, right? So again, you have to go into it with the lens of ask why until you can't ask why anymore. Why is the diverticula in the colon inflamed? To briefly also review the difference between Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and even celiac disease. Ironically, celiac disease is not lumped into that IBD category. I think I'm honestly not sure why. It's still an autoimmune process just like the rest of these are. But nonetheless, you won't see that referenced as a part of IBD. So we'll go over briefly the difference between all three of these. It really comes down to what is being attacked and where the attack is occurring. So I'm going to start with celiac, even though it's the very bottom one. As we all know and appreciate, celiac disease occurs in the small intestines, and it's an autoimmune attack against the microvilli in the intestinal, the inner part of the intestines. Specifically, typically tissue transglutamase. It's a specific enzyme that's in the microvilli, and that is what's actually being attacked. Nonetheless, in celiac disease, microvilli exist to increase the absorptive powers of the intestines. Surface area, thank you. It's like, it's not powers. Yes, surface area of the intestines. Yes, so there's more space basically to absorb food. So it looks like shag carpet normally. In celiac disease, it now looks like Berber. The gold standard for diagnosing celiac disease is through an intestinal biopsy. However, you can do celiac testing, endomycelial and tissue transglutamase antibody testing in blood. It's one of those, there's a lot of false negatives, but if it's positive, then you have celiac kind of thing. So it's not the most sensitive, but it is possible. Actually, let's go to Crohn's. Crohn's can affect any location within the intestines. I mean, really anything from the mouth all the way down. And the difference here is Crohn's actually, the immune system is actually attacking all layers of the intestinal walls. So it's very severe. Crohn's, people tend to be very symptomatic, extremely painful GI symptoms, painful bowel movements, bleedings, or blood present in the stools, loss of appetite, loss of weight, and typically symptoms elsewhere too, systemic symptoms. That's the biggest difference between Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, though, is Crohn's can happen anywhere, and it attacks all layers of the intestinal walls. Same thing. Same thing. Ulcerative colitis, on the other hand, only occurs in the colon and attacks the innermost lining. Yeah.
In terms of the management, like conventional management of Crohn's, obviously the infusions is quite common, but testing calprotectin a lot. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. And I just am skeptical of
Gotcha. Yeah. So is the question like how sensitive calprotectin is? Okay. Calprotectin's actually, we'll talk about that in the GIFX stool test because it's one of the markers that are included. And the research is pretty substantial, showing that it is a sensitive marker for it. So if calprotectin comes back positive, it's an inflammatory marker essentially. If calprotectin comes back positive, it's not necessarily, the research that I've read doesn't say you can make a diagnosis of irritable bowel disease, but it says it should be, follow-up testing should be done to rule it in or rule it out. Does that make sense?
Also, like, for example, I think in 200, right, they want to see that under 120.
Okay.
And so it's more of like are we moving in the right direction in terms of inflammation?
Gotcha.
If you're like testing.
I think that would be a great, if you already know that Crohn's exists
Oh, yeah,
and you're
not a
using,
diagnosis thing, like, just to make
yeah.
sure that she's doing like lots of
Okay,
infusions, which-
gotcha. Yeah, yeah. I think calprotectin would be a great way to do follow-up testing. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, and that way you're not having to scope and do invasive testing every single time. For sure. Yeah. Okay. Brief little picture here on the difference, identifying it. This is partly how Crohn's versus ulcerative colitis is diagnosed. So obviously you can see very clear in a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, this, what they call cobblestoning or the pseudopolyps. It's basically swelling of the intestines, if you will. And there will be ulceration where the bowel walls are actually starting, the immune system is actually starting to degrade the bowel walls, or the intestinal walls, I should say. The interesting thing about Crohn's disease and this fat wrapping, that was something I had never heard of, but it's present in a large percentage of Crohn's disease patients. And what happens is fat starts to form and migrate around the mesentery of the intestines. Mesentery is essentially the connective tissue. And when I was starting to look into it, a lot of research doesn't know why. They recognize that it's there, that it's often a clinical feature of Crohn's disease. They don't know what function it has. So some of the proposed hypotheses were it could potentially be a mediator of the inflammatory response. And then in the same article, they were saying it could actually be trying to squelch the inflammatory response, because adipose tissue, as we all know, adipose tissue doesn't just produce, it's just inert substance. It produces chemokines and cytokines and immune signaling molecules and peptides that can both encourage inflammation, but it can also stop inflammation. So they think that this fat wrapping has something to do with mediating the inflammatory response in some way. Again, it wasn't very clear on what's causing it. The third hypothesis is that there's some evidence of Crohn's being a result of infection, like an underlying chronic, typically bacterial infection. And one gene that's associated with Crohn's is NOD2, which affects the ability for the immune system to recognize certain bacteria. So what happens is bacteria essentially get lodged in different parts of the intestines. In normal people, this gene would activate the immune system's ability to see it and eliminate it. But here that doesn't happen. So then it cross-reacts, and the immune system will start to, in an attempt to eradicate an infection, will also start to cross-react into the intestines. So the fat, coming back to that, sometimes the bacteria can be lodged or encourage the growth of fat. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. Not a whole lot of clear evidence from what I could tell, but multiple times that fat wrapping, or fat creep is also what it's called, was discussed or mentioned. Okay, so moving into causes of dysfunction. I bring up this graph. This is something I go over with all of my clients so they kind of understand the role of inflammation. I bring it up here because, as I mentioned before, about 80% of disease arises in the intestines, largely through leaky gut syndrome mechanisms. But to apply how that occurs and how that affects the rest of the body, we also have to look at the immune cascade, right? The inflammatory cascade. So inflammation, very simply put, because a lot of people, you hear this term, but a lot of people have a hard time defining it. Inflammation is the immune system's response to injury. That's it. Some people say injury and infection. Some people lump infection into injury. So either way, but we know there's 3 categories of injury. There's physical injury. Physical injury counts as like an acute injury, like cutting your arm, spraining your ankle, breaking that never heals appropriately, for example, or like a broken bone, that never heals appropriately, or like osteoarthritis, scoliosis, things along those lines. There's chemical injury. I'm using the term stress and injury interchangeably here, by the way. Chemical injury accounts for many different factors, right? Hormone imbalance, toxicity from the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, food sensitivities, even genetics could be wrapped into this. Dysbiosis being a big one. Conducting a thorough health history and testing analysis is to identify what the people that we're working with, what their sources of injury are, and then systematically prioritize and eliminate them. The gut being a big place to do that, right? Because a lot of issues can occur in the intestines. All right, so that's applying gut issues to the rest of the body, right? That was the whole point of that conversation. So now let's get into, we're talking about causes of dysfunction. We have to talk about large intestinal dysbiosis. So let me, oh, I apologize. Yes, I revised this after printing. So there's some slides that you guys won't have, and I'll just email this PowerPoint to everybody, if that's okay. Okay, so looking at dysbiosis, first let's define the difference between dysbiosis and infection. So infection refers to the presence of a microbe that is never supposed to be there, like a parasite, for example, or certain strains of bacteria, right? It's never normal, and it will always elicit some kind of an immune response. In dysbiosis, it's different because the microbes are supposed to be there, they're just in inappropriate levels. So that can be an overgrowth of either commensal or pathogenic bacteria, or an undergrowth of the beneficial bacteria. But nonetheless, like I said, the biggest difference is that they're supposed to be there, it's just the quantities, okay? With that said, probiotics often get a lot of attention, and rightfully so. We have about 2 to 5 pounds of bacteria that live in the large intestines, largely in the large intestines. We have some bacteria that live in the small intestines, but there's not supposed to be that many. I mean, we're in the thousands, really and truly, of bacteria that are in the small intestines. We covered small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, in depth in part 1. That is a condition that it accounts for about 50 to 85% of irritable bowel syndrome. And it's getting a lot more attention these days. So it's obviously very common. Nonetheless, most of the bacteria are supposed to live in the colon. These bacteria are so metabolically active that researchers are starting to refer to them as kind of a long lost organ. And we're just now beginning to scratch the surface on what these guys do. But when you consider the fact that bacterial DNA outnumbers human DNA by a ratio of about 10 to 1, in other words, they literally outnumber us, it really raises the question of who's hosting who. And it allows us to really appreciate the role, the systemic role that these bacteria are going to have on our overall health, right? So in other words, we're covered in bacteria. A lot of them live in the colon, but they're on our skin, they're in our mouth, they're all over the place, okay? When the bad guys start to overgrow, or when there's not enough of the good, then we start to have a problem. So we'll look at some of those patterns, common patterns that you'll see in stool testing. Before we do that, I want to talk about parasitic infections. So contrary to popular belief, you do not have to have traveled abroad to get a parasite, right? They are, I don't want to say common. I run a lot of stool tests, and they're probably 20% of the people that I see. Here's the problem with parasites. They're difficult to test for. That's the other issue. So it's very possible to come up negative for parasite testing. And part of why that is because of the life cycle of a parasite. Now, parasite refers to an organism that lives on or in the host and gets its food from or at the expense of the host, right? There's many different kinds of parasites. There are some that are microscopic and can reproduce via mitosis. There are some that are full-on worms, right? We've all seen those horror stories. The ones that are full-on worms, and they actually mate and lay eggs within the intestines. So I'm going to talk a little bit about roundworm just to give you an idea. That is something, if anybody comes, sits down in your office and says, hey, I'm pooping worms, there's the possibility that it's a roundworm. I've seen that one before. But I'm going to go over the life cycle too, so you guys can kind of appreciate what's involved in parasites. Before we launch into that, I mentioned that some of these parasites are microscopic and can reproduce via mitosis, meaning they can essentially just kind of reproduce on their own. Blastocystis hominis is something that I've seen come back probably several times actually in people. So it's one of the more common ones that I see. It is microscopic. It can reproduce via mitosis. And in a lot of people, they're asymptomatic. They don't have symptoms per se. There's question of if blastocystis is actually just part of the normal mycology. Nothing's been determined on that. So it kind of just depends on which article you're reading, that some say, well, it doesn't elicit an immune response and it doesn't cause symptoms in people, so maybe it's just normal, but not everybody has it, and it does cause symptoms in some people. So there's this kind of back and forth. One interesting thing though is I found an article showing that Saccharomyces boulardii, so supplementing with Sac boulardii, can be an effective way at eliminating blastocystis, which is pretty cool. Saccharomyces boulardii, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's a beneficial yeast. It's technically a yeast, it's not a bacteria, but it's a beneficial yeast that's really helpful at rebalancing the gut microbiome and the terrain in general. They use it a lot for traveler's diarrhea, so oftentimes parasitic infections cause diarrhea. The other thing about dysbiosis is it rarely occurs in isolation. So you'll often see like a parasitic infection and then skewed levels of bacteria. Sometimes yeast will kind of piggyback with parasites. So you can have multiple things going on at once, in other words. Okay, going back to roundworm and how some of these parasites will reproduce. And not only that, looking at how this can become a very serious problem, right? So these parasites, one of the ways that they flourish, they typically inhabit the small intestines. That's where they're going to get the most food, right? One of the ways that they flourish is they will, once ingested, because typically humans are infected by eating contaminated food or being exposed to fecal matter in some way. So ingested through the mouth, typically you can inhale it, you can get it through your skin, but nonetheless will stay through the mouth. Once there, they'll start to, some forms that, especially those that actually lay eggs, will adhere to the intestinal walls and lay the eggs, referred to as ova, in the intestinal wall. From there, like in the case of roundworm, these eggs will hatch. One female roundworm can lay up to 200,000 eggs per day. They're also capable, the females are capable of laying eggs without being fertilized, meaning they don't have to have a male roundworm to be present. But in those cases, they don't actually hatch. It has to wait, they'll eventually just pass through. But nonetheless, they will lay the eggs within the intestinal lining, and then when the eggs do hatch, they release the larvae, and those larvae are capable of penetrating the intestinal lining and getting into systemic circulation. So from there, especially with roundworm, but really this can happen with any kind of parasite, they're capable of, and same thing with fungus, right? Candida will do this too. Break down the intestinal lining and get into systemic circulation. And then we talk about biofilms, then you start to appreciate how this can get really bad really fast. So parasites, this also explains why, for example, like roundworm in dogs, right? How the parasites are getting into the heart is via this pathway. They got through the intestinal lining, they start circulating in the blood, and then they'll inhabit different organs. What's most common in people is, especially with roundworm, is the lungs. So they'll migrate to the lungs, and this is such an interesting life cycle. Okay, they'll migrate to the lungs, lay eggs there, they hatch, mature, and then they'll actually escape via the bronchial tubes, and then you swallow them back, and it's this cycle. So keep in mind, when I say escape via the bronchial tubes, you're not coughing up worms. These are, no, even though when you Google this stuff, it's pretty gnarly. There's, worms everywhere. But typically it's it's the larvae, right? It's the larvae stage where that's happening. So you might cough, or simply it just, they're connected. Bronchial and then esophagus, so it's just kind of this like lump over, and then it goes back down to the intestinal tract, they lay eggs again, and this whole process occurs. The cyclical pattern is part of what makes testing for parasites very difficult. Not the eggs and ova won't pass with every single bowel movement. First of all, they're in the small intestines, so they won't pass with every single bowel movement. And if it's not a full-on worm, sometimes they're microscopic. So that's why in a lot of stool testing, you'll see the option for a 1-day collection or up to a 6-day collection. If you're really concerned with parasites, the more collections, the better, because there's a higher chance that something is going to pass through. You'll see it referred to as the dormant stage with parasites, where it's more so the eggs that are present more than the fully matured adults. And that's why. So that's where stool testing, sensitive stool testing, should be able to identify any one of those stages, either the ova or the parasites themselves, or both. But because parasitic infections largely occur in the small intestines, symptoms often reflect small intestinal issues. Now, again, you really can't divide the GI tract between upper and lower. So parasite testing is almost exclusively done via stool testing. I haven't heard of anything else being done, unless it's a severe overgrowth, and you might be able to catch it in an endoscopy of like roundworms, tapeworms, things along those lines. Abdominal pain, weight loss. So if somebody's complaining about, one word on weight loss, somebody's complaining about GI symptoms and they're exhibiting weight loss, like unintended weight loss, immediately think small intestines, because that's where you do about 90% of your absorbing, right? You only really absorb water and some vitamins and minerals from the colon. So abdominal pain, weight loss, IBS type symptoms, megaloblastic anemia, B12 deficiency anemia, sometimes vitamin K as well. General malaise, right? These people just don't feel well. Oftentimes they just don't look well. Dark circles under the eyes indicating nutrient deficiencies, kind of this grayish tone sometimes, thinning hair. A lot of this is coming back to the malabsorption issues too. And then sometimes passing of worms. So I've worked with 2 people that brought them in and show the full-on worms. Or one had, they were like these, he was passing these like dinosaur egg looking things and had been for years. And so, that's one of those, like if you're passing worms, it's not really a question. Yeah, I know. He'd been dealing with it for a really long time. Like he's been to multiple doctors trying to deal with it. So yes, so parasites, definitely important to, that's another reason for stool testing. I don't want to say that they're common, but I don't want to say that they're uncommon either. And sometimes it's possible to identify without stool testing, like I said, if you're passing worms, but sometimes it's not. Like blastocystis hominis, you're not going to see without performing some kind of a test. Okay. Yeah.
In regards to blasto, I heard someone say one time that like this livestock breeds, that they come off frolic when the moon is full.
Yeah.
Have you heard this?
Yes. Yeah.
True?
With all parasites, there's this. I don't know if it's true or not, but this relationship between the full moon and them being more active or eggs hatching, I've heard of that, but like I said, I don't know if it's true or not. Yeah. And I'm not really sure in vivo if it would really be possible to evaluate. It might be able to, in vivo meaning like in the intestines, if it's possible to evaluate. In vitro maybe, or if you're just looking at just the general activity of parasites, but not necessarily in the form of an infection. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know if that's just a rumor or kind of like an urban legend myth, or if maybe they are actually more active. Yeah, good question though. Keep in mind the other thing with parasitic infections is oftentimes they're asymptomatic. So people won't always have symptoms. There was somebody who I worked with that came back with blastocystis, and we ran a stool testing on him because he was just curious. He had no GI symptoms. 3 bowel movements a day. They were solid, brown, formed, easy. I mean, everything was ideal and optimal. Absolutely no symptoms. He feels generally well overall, and blasto came back. So it was like, oh, all right, you're an asymptomatic one. And that raises the question, do you treat it? Do you not? Things like that. So we just did Staph boulardii, didn't do this full-on like eradication approach, and it was just some Saccharomyces boulardii and high levels of probiotics. But yeah, keep that in mind too. They're not always symptomatic. However, in that same case, his eosinophils on his blood labs are persistently high, like 15, like very high. So that's one thing, talking about testing eosinophilia, elevated levels of eosinophils. Eosinophils are a type of immune cell, and there's actually an acronym for what eosinophils go after. It's NAACP, and the P in that is parasites. So neoplasm, Addison's disease, allergies. I never remember what the C is. And then P is parasites. So trends, in other words, if you see high eosinophils, think about one of those things. And yeah, same. I mean, they were lab high on multiple different lab tests. So yeah, kind of, it's affecting him in some way. It's stimulating the immune system in some way. Okay, fungal overgrowth. This is very common. Common meaning, when you hear about IBS symptoms or just things to kind of conditions to look at within the intestinal tract, Candida is a big one. There are many forms of yeast that are capable of inhabiting the intestinal tract. So it's not just Candida. For time's sake today, I'm only talking about candidiasis. Candidiasis is the term for an overgrowth of Candida. There's also many different forms of Candida. Candida albicans gets the most attention, but there's Candida krusei, there's Candida ruders, there's multiple different forms of Candida too. Candida does normally reside in the intestinal tract. So it is part of the normal population. It only becomes a problem when it starts to overgrow. And there's a few different things that can perpetuate the growth of Candida. High sugar diet, poor diet in general, frequent antibiotic use, high levels of stress, any of that gastrointestinal dysfunction we talked about before, so hypochlorhydria, for example, all of these can allow for the proliferation of Candida, and that's when it becomes a problem. So Candida, any of these more pathogenic bacteria, parasites, Candida, they all, the best example I can give, just like you and I, after we eat, we go to the bathroom and burp and fart and release everything, so do these microbes. So one of the biggest problems with them is it's essentially like taking your trash and throwing it out in the living room. You're constantly recycling toxins that the overgrowth of these microbes are producing. Lipopolysaccharides, for example, which are the kind of on the outer membranes of gram-negative bacteria, when they're absorbed through the intestinal lining, they're one of the most inflammatory components. In a lot of studies, when they're trying to elicit an inflammatory response, they'll use lipopolysaccharides. So this is a problem. That's where kind of gut issues can become a systemic problem, right? Candida being one of them. Very simple, when you think about the fact that yeast is used to ferment and create alcohol, well, now you kind of have this alcohol producing machine in your intestines is another way of looking at it. So you're constantly having to filter through those toxins. Okay. The other thing with Candida is it's capable of penetrating the epithelial lining. So, and from there becoming a systemic infection. This is something that I've seen a few times, and it's pretty interesting. Candida is not, we hear a lot about it being in the stool. It doesn't have to be isolated in the stool. It's also possible to have a systemic yeast overgrowth. So if somebody does come back with positive stool tests for Candida, I highly encourage you to start evaluating if it's a systemic problem. So ways to do that. Some of the most common ones, if they have a red, raised, itchy rash that oftentimes it'll come and go, it's typically, but not exclusively, in the moist areas of the body. So the armpits, the groin, I've seen it in the eyelids before. That can be indicative of a systemic yeast issue, especially if it comes and goes. So a lot of people, they're like, what the hell is this rash? And they'll go to the doctor, they go to the dermatologist gives some kind of an antifungal and or a steroid, that it's gone, and they think they're fine, and then the thing comes back. They do the same thing, it goes away, and then the thing comes back. If it keeps coming back, it's not just on the skin, it's in the blood, right? That's why it keeps coming back. Women with vaginal yeast infections that are very frequent, same thing. It's translocating. So this yeast, it could have originated in the intestines. A lot of the time it does. It originates in the intestines and then seeps through into the blood, and yeast love warm, moist environment, so that it translocates to the vagina. Again, oftentimes these people will try multiple treatments, suppository treatments for the Candida. It goes and then it comes back. If it keeps coming back, it's not just isolated to the vagina, it's also in the blood. So interestingly, and this is just clinical feedback, a lot of food sensitivity tests will test against yeast, and some will actually test against Candida, so they'll test antibodies to Candida. One guy that I had is he had normal bowel movements. He'd had no symptoms of GI dysfunction. He was coming in for just a health evaluation. This was at the doctor's office I worked for. Just wanted to see the objective state of his health. So we ran a stool test, and everything basically came back normal. It was more like, yeah, here's a probiotic, but you look fine. No Candida, in other words, no yeast at all. We ran a food sensitivity test, and Candida albicans came back in the red. It was very highly reactive. And I was like, that's really weird. It's possible that it's a cross reaction. Maybe, you also have a sensitivity to like baker's yeast or brewer's yeast. But I asked him, hey, let me put this out there. Do you ever notice a red, raised, itchy rash in the moist areas of your body? He's like, I have had this thing come and go for years, right around the groin area. Same thing. He was like, I would take this and it would go away and then it would come back. So one of the doctors I worked with prescribed fluconazole. Fluconazole is a prescriptive absorptive antifungal, and the thing went away like that and it was done. So just keep that in mind, that it is possible for that yeast to become systemic. It's not sepsis. It can cause, especially in the immunocompromised, if it's nosocomial, so it's in hospitals with the severely immune depressed, or just the severely sick, this yeast can start to form biofilms within the rest of the body, and that can cause mortality or like severe sickness. Which brings me to my next point, biofilms. Is there anybody here that has not heard of biofilms? Okay, yeah, they don't get a whole lot of attention, which is pretty interesting. Basically, biofilms are how bacteria are going to rule the world. It's not just bacteria, it's microorganisms, and they already do, right? They really already do. But nonetheless, biofilms it's like a protective sheath. So when these bacteria or fungus or parasites, any kind of microbe can do this, when they're not in isolation and they start to form colonies, they form these biofilms. And it's this protective sheath that helps them evade the immune system and evade conventional treatments like antibiotics, antifungals. This is how resistances occur, partly. Some forms of bacteria and yeast can actually morph also. So they become resistant to antibiotics. But nonetheless, this is why oftentimes antibiotics or antifungals are not effective. These microbes are kind of encapsulated, if you will, and protected. So this is also kind of where we make the leap between an acute infection and a chronic infection. So an acute infection, to a very large degree, antibiotics have taken care of, which is why there's far fewer deaths from acute infection than there were 100 years ago, right, pre-antibiotics. Acute infection would be like food poisoning. It's the presence of a microbe, the treatment or your natural immune response gets rid of it, and it's done, right? The thing goes away. However, when neither one of those mechanisms occur, either there's not treatment or the immune system isn't able to eliminate it, then some of these microbes will start to set up shop and colonize, actually reproduce and then colonize and form these biofilms. So the point being, if you yourself or if you're working with somebody that's trying to get rid of any kind of an overgrowth, parasitic, fungal, bacterial, whatever it might be, always include some form of biofilm disruptor. This is critical. Even if they're undergoing conventional treatment, if they're taking antibiotics, if they're taking antifungals, support them with that as well. Otherwise, there's a very good chance it's not going to be effective. The other thing with biofilms too, this is part of where you'll hear, some of you might have heard about the relationship between like mouth infections or mouth bacteria that originate in the mouth, and then it goes through, it's absorbed and translocates into the heart, and you're getting these heart infections, and heart infection meaning like cardiovascular disease. They can form biofilms within different organs internally as well. So again, looking at it from a systemic point of view, biofilms are a really big problem and need to be addressed. And we'll talk about that when I talk about different supplements that you can take when trying to eradicate overgrowths and infections. This is a study I'll let you guys read on your own, but it's talking about the evaluation of biofilm formation with Candida specifically and the effects that it has. And then we'll get into testing. So all of this testing, this is just general. If you're trying to evaluate someone's GI tract, if somebody comes in with overt GI dysfunction, these are a lot of the go-to tests that I will recommend. We're not going to talk about all of these, but they can give you a pretty global picture about what might be going on. So hydrogen breath test is the most commonly used test. It's kind of the gold standard for SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Hydrogen breath testing, as the name implies, measures hydrogen. Most tests these days also measure methane, which are the two predominant gases that are produced in SIBO. Food sensitivity testing. I talked about both of these in depth in part 1. Food sensitivity testing obviously measures an immune response to different types of food. Not all of them are created equal. The short take home on this is I strongly encourage, antibody testing is kind of, it's out, meaning it's not that sensitive. It's very easy to get false negatives. Antibody testing traditionally looks at immunoglobulin A and immunoglobulin G specifically. IgE testing is more allergy, but some food sensitivity tests will wrap that into it too. One of the problems with that is, first of all, you have to look at the overall state of the immune system. So if somebody has any kind of immunocompromise, it's not going to show up accurate. Secondly, you'll form antibodies to foods naturally, just as a way of getting rid of the food byproducts, right? So you'll form it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the immune system is launching an attack. It's just saying, hey, it's just a tag saying, hey, we just need to get rid of this. It's done. So food antibody testing, most of the time you'll see people come back with a few, and they're moderate severity. It's not that sensitive. So what I recommend is actually measuring the white blood cell response. And that's done typically through measuring the cytokines, so the chemical mediator response. There's 2 labs that I'm aware of that do that. MRT is mediator response testing. The lab is Oxford Biomedical, but it's called the LEAP or MRT test. and Alcat, which most people have probably heard of. The founder started the same company. So same guy started both companies, but the technology is slightly different, but both of them measure the white blood cell response. So if your immune system is actually producing cytokines and chemokines, it's actively launching an attack and trying to draw more immune cells to the site. So we can deduce at that point that it is launching an attack against that food, which is clinically what a food sensitivity is, right? So keep that in mind. Blood chemistry testing, there are just certain patterns that you can see that can be indicative. Sometimes, looking at immune cell patterns, for example, I mentioned the eosinophilia. So if you see, basically eosinophils above 3 is where I start looking and thinking, is there a parasite? Do you have allergies? Kind of what food sensitivities? What's going on here? Elevated, functionally or lab elevated white blood cells or low would suggest either an acute issue or a chronic issue, respectively. So in other words, blood chemistry testing, you can start to identify little patterns. It won't indicate like, yes, this person has a GI overgrowth or a GI infection, but it might say, hey, coupled with your symptoms and your history and these patterns that I'm seeing, maybe we should run this test and kind of point you in a different direction. Same thing with blood chemistry testing. You can also look at malabsorptive patterns. So a complete metabolic panel, a CMP, will have total protein, which is comprised of albumin and globulin. From a functional point of view, you have to have hydrochloric acid in order to digest and absorb protein. So if total protein's low, functionally, you can start to think, look around and see if you see other signs and symptoms of hypochlorhydria. They're not digesting and absorbing appropriately. Low iron, low calcium, low magnesium, all of those, low B12, megaloblastic anemia, all of those nutrients you have to have stomach acid in order to absorb. So if those are low, you can ask the question, let me look at the rest of this person's clinical picture. Maybe malabsorption is a problem, be it hypochlorhydria, bacterial parasitic overgrowths that are basically eating the nutrients. So just little, again, not causative factors, but associative factors that you can look at. A lot of people are going to have blood labs too. It's part of a routine physical, the 9-hour health fair and get them run for $50. So a lot of people will have those, and it's just a way to kind of get an early insight to see if there might be some GI issues. Okay, stool testing is where we're going to spend a lot of our time. Stool testing, there's many different varieties of stool testing. Everything from what the gastroenterologist is going to run up to what we're looking at here is GI effects. Gastroenterologists, I can't speak for them, but in my experience, they tend to run stool testing to rule in or rule out either parasites or infectious microbes. What I'm trying to say is they're not the most comprehensive stool tests. So if somebody comes in, I bring this up because this has happened a lot. If somebody comes in and they're having severe GI issues and you suggest a stool test, and they're like, oh, that's okay, my GI doc ran one and nothing came up, run it anyways. Run a better one, in other words, because there's so much that can still be going on that this kind of snippet of a test missed, because it's only testing for certain things, right? So GI-FX is the most comprehensive stool test I'm aware of at this point. Genova Labs runs it. We, unfortunately, as nutrition practitioners, do not have the ability to get an account with Genova Labs. So if you have a doctor that you work with or trust and they're willing to work with you, you can work with them about opening an account, and then they can, you would obviously just order the testing through them. Direct Labs is another means of getting your hands on this kind of test. Direct Labs is something that we can all open accounts with because they'll sell directly even to the client. So that's a way of getting this. You can, yeah, all of Genova's testing. Yeah, for sure. No, they just sell third party. So there's a slight markup on the test because of that, making an already expensive test even more expensive. But you can still get it. Exactly. But easy pay. Yeah, for sure. So what she's talking about is Genova has their own insurance billing program. It's called Easy Pay. Won't go into it too much in detail, but basically what that does is it removes the practitioner from billing insurance, but still allows the client to bill insurance. So what they do is provide they essentially pay a copay and provide all of their insurance information. Genova then bills insurance. Traditionally speaking, what insurance denies would typically come back to the client in the form of a bill. In this case, Genova eats it. So they take it. And the client will never pay more than that initial copay cost, which is usually, depending on what add-ons you do, anywhere between $150 to $250, depending on the test also, specifically speaking to GIFX though. So yeah, there's a benefit to working with a doctor that's able to do that. But nonetheless, this test retails for, I think the wholesale non-insurance price is around like $450, $500, maybe more. I think Direct Labs, it's up to $600 now. So it's pricey for sure. And that's oftentimes one of the barriers to getting it run, is it's just expensive. Nonetheless, you can learn a lot of information about the objective state of the person's intestinal health. So GIFX, as we're seeing here, measures the 4 pillars of digestive function. It's also kind of organized by level of importance. So infection, inflammation, insufficiency looks at digestive and absorptive patterns. Imbalance is the dysbiotic aspect. So we'll jump into each of those pillars more in depth in just a second. Next, on the lower half of the page, we're looking at diversity association and relative abundance. So if you think about the microbiome like a city, optimally, you want a moderate amount of people, but those people all have many different skill sets, right? So you've got doctors, lawyers, mechanics, teachers, all of these different skill sets, but you don't have too many of them, right? We all can appreciate what happens to a city when it gets overgrown. It gets congested, there's traffic everywhere, there's lines everywhere, it just gets difficult. Same concept here, except imagine if in a city, now we have an overgrown city, and they all do, all of the people that live there have 3 jobs, right? They're all mechanics, all this, all that. Things are going to start to fall apart, right? There's going to be gaps. Same concept with the microbiome. So what we want to see optimally is that diversity association. We'd like to see that the higher the better, basically. A large diverse population of microbes, because they all do have different functions. So we like to see that higher. Relative abundance, we don't want too many. That's where we start to get into an overgrowth pattern. So we don't want too many in comparison to a healthy cohort. So this particular person, it doesn't take a trained eye to see that this is not a normal result, right? Just glancing at it, which is what this first page is, just the interpretation at a glance, we see that there's an inflammatory response happening specifically with eosinophil protein X, which is what EPX is. Digestion and absorption is taking a pretty big hit, looking at low pancreatic enzyme output, which is what the pancreatic elastase is, high fecal fats, and low protein. Imbalance, we're seeing total short-chain fatty acids are low as well. And then he's got low diversity, but an overgrowth of bacteria. So looking into this further to start to break down each of these sections, excuse me, this is the digestion and absorption section. Okay, remember when I was talking about that feedback loop where hydrochloric acid, passed into the duodenum. That acidity triggers the pancreas to release digestive enzymes, bile, etc., and then it passes on. This is classic. So if there's, look at products of protein breakdown, it's the second marker there, that black dots in the yellow nearing the red. What this is saying is there's a high levels of protein, measurable protein, not peptides, but protein in the stool, which means that it wasn't appropriately broken down nor absorbed, which is why it's coming out in the feces. It's an indication of hypochlorhydria. That coupled with the low pancreatic enzyme output. So he doesn't have enough hydrochloric acid. These large food molecules are then being passed into, in low, I guess high acidity, are being passed into the duodenum and not appropriately eliciting the pancreas to release its enzymes, etc. From there, his fecal fats are okay, but the total fecal fat's high and the phospholipids are high. Same thing, bile isn't being released. Let me give you the clinical picture of this guy. He comes in with fatigue, old middle-aged guy, generally just not feeling that great, but he's got gas, bloating, distension, acid reflux. What's bringing him in are his GI symptoms, okay? I don't think I include his test in this one. I included it in part 1. Long story short, what's going on here, because again, you have to ask why until you can't ask why anymore. So why does he have low hydrochloric acid? Why isn't it stimulating the pancreas appropriately? His major issue was SIBO. So in a hydrogen breath test, I mean, it was classic. It went from low to high, and it was just this classic response. SIBO was one of his main issues. He often took Tums. He often took Nexium because of the acid reflux that he was having. So when you see this pattern, oh, the other thing with that is some bacterial strains in SIBO will actually eat bile salts. So we'll see fat malabsorption as a result of it. Like feeding the problem. Yeah, I know what you mean. I still did it. I gave him an overall digestive enzyme that had a little bit of bile in it while using the Canavactin regimen. So killing off the bugs at the same time while supporting digestion. Yeah, for sure. So his was a classic pattern. And yes, this is a stool test, but we're still able to evaluate small intestinal function, right? It's not, again, it's not limited or isolated. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so with Crohn's, I guess they're saying anything, if they're happy to go like that.
Okay, wow.
But, you know,
this is looking at the functional.
So much higher.
Exactly. Yeah, and I imagine what's happening there is in order to make a diagnosis based on blood work, it has to be outside of the lab reference range. That's probably what this is here, is they want it below that, you know, it's not optimal, that kind of thing is what I'm suspecting is kind of going on there. Yeah. So next, looking at that section, the inflammation and immunology section, calprotectin, all of these are listed in order of severity. So calprotectin, as we were just talking about, is a clinical indicator can be of irritable bowel disease. It's a pretty significant heavy hitter, in other words. For me, when anybody comes back with a positive calprotectin, I'll usually refer them, especially if it's in the red and they have no idea, I'll usually refer them for a colonoscopy to rule in or rule out IBD. Eosinophil protein X is mediated by the eosinophil immune system, you know, that branch of the immune system. This one, when I've taken Genova's training to interpret these tests, largely associated sometimes with parasites, often with food sensitivities, often with food allergies. EPX can mediate a histamine release or histamine sensitivity. Excuse me. So often food allergies. With this guy, we concurrently ran food sensitivities at the same time. But when this test was run, he hadn't started eliminating them. He didn't know what they were yet. So I attributed that largely to a food sensitivity problem. Looking back, he might have also had a histamine problem. from the SIBO. Excuse me, guys. Fecal secretory IgA is just your nondescript immune response. Sick IgA is released by the mucosal lining. It's one of the first lines of defense within the intestines. It's just an antibody. You should have some level of Sig IgA. So when it's below this detectable limit, I start to wonder about immunocompromise, more of a chronic issue that's been going on for a long time. It's not necessarily a good thing when it's below detectable limits. If it's within the green, that's fine, but not DL, which is what that means. So something is stimulating an immune response in this guy's intestines, in other words. Looking at the breakdown of the commensal bacteria here, this test looks at 24 different commensal bacteria. Most notably, what I want to point out here is the fact that they are almost all high, right? So that's where we start to, again, recognize the presence of dysbiosis and overgrowth of these bacteria. Within there, you can also start to look at individual species. If you look at the lactobacillus or the bifidobacteria, E. coli, things along those lines, and start to see imbalances within each individual species. There's still so much research. I personally don't bacteria chase, meaning I don't look at each individual species within this. I try to look at the patterns and the trends. There are some that are pretty consistent, like Prevotella, for example, has been associated with arthritic conditions and heart disease. So if the person's also presenting with that and you see an elevation in Prevotella, there might be a connection there. Clinically speaking, Klebsiella pneumoniae, which you won't see in this list because it's a potentially pathogenic bacteria. I'll show you that page on a different test. I often see that concurrently present with like arthritic pain, joint pain, and or GI pain. So again, not something I've read about, just something that I see often. But keep that in mind that some of those extra intestinal manifestations can occur, and there's a pretty good, well-established link between certain types of microbes. Okay, getting into nutrition solutions. Really comes down to what the actual problem is. These are all going to be global recommendations. So if anybody we work with, we're going to want to put them on an anti-inflammatory and low glycemic diet, right? Good starting point is paleo, a way to just clear the slate, right? Get out the gluten, get out the dairy, corn, sugar, soy. Some people might have to eliminate all grains. If they have severe digestive compromise, lectins in general, so grains and phytates, grains, beans, they might need to soak their nuts and seeds, just kind of make things easier to digest. Food sensitivity testing, I'm a proponent of testing, for especially those that are exhibiting overt symptoms, because elimination diets, to give you an idea with the MRT testing that I use, I've seen people react off the charts to spinach or cucumber, things that you're not going to identify in an elimination diet. So if you clean up their diet significantly and they're still having these issues, that can be a great place to start. The other nice thing about food sensitivity testing is there's no cost for the quote-unquote treatment, right? You just eliminate food. So they can start acting on it immediately without also, they just paid several $100s for a test, and now they have to pay several $100s for whatever recommendations they're going to make. So food sensitivity testing can be really helpful for that. And food sensitivity testing also defines one man's food being another man's poison. So I recommend that when possible. Yeah.
I think they are reacting to somewhat benign things like spinach or blueberries or whatever it is, and maybe it's just that they have leaky gut and therefore their system is just kind of attacking thing, or do you really feel like it's should eliminate spinach and eliminate all the stuff that comes? Because sometimes it comes back and it's just
several things.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this seems to be a preferential thing for practitioners in my experience. Some practitioners don't want to test food sensitivities unless they've started this gut healing protocol and they've tried to heal the intestinal lining first, because so many foods will come back. My personal school of thought is removing identifiable food sensitivities will accelerate the healing of the intestines. So that's kind of how I see it. To some degree, finances will dictate if we're able to do it. So if they're able to, then I'll do it. That, and a lot of people get relief. They get a pretty good amount of relief by eliminating sensitive foods. However, I rarely do follow-up food sensitivity testing, because it changes sometimes. Sometimes, not always though, sometimes it's pretty consistent, but I'll rarely do follow-up. The other thing too is, I think I've talked about this before, I think there's a big mind-body component to food sensitivities. So if the people that come back with many, and eliminating all of them is going to be a very prohibitive process, I'll have them eliminate the big ones and the foods that they're eating most often, and then really start to try to reestablish a healthy relationship with food. Because at least in my experience, sometimes that can be a problem too, is it's more of a mental component that's manifesting this way. So I think there's a lot to it. Yeah, for sure. Leaky gut syndrome, obviously that can definitely cause these multiple food sensitivities. But eliminating them for a period of time and then starting to reintroduce. I think oftentimes in alternative medicine, the reintroduction process is sometimes missed, and people just get on these severely limited diets for kind of prolonged periods of time. Yeah, and I think that's really important, and that's also where that mind-body component comes back to. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, this isn't like you're maintaining diet. Yeah, maybe 30 days, kick out the big ones, and then let's start to get things moving. Yeah, for sure. Okay, Candida diet. This is something we all learn about in depth, especially going through this school. But yeast ferments sugar, right? We can all appreciate that. Yeast ferments sugar. And so in a Candida diet, if Candida is identified, be it in the stool or the blood or both, eliminating sugar is an important component of this, while simultaneously, I highly suggest simultaneously implementing some kind of a antimicrobial regimen too. So 30 to 45 days typically for the regimen and eliminating the sugars, but it can sometimes go up to 3 months, if not longer. Sometimes, especially with the biofilms, these things can be really persistent. So when I say sugar, I mean fruit, starchy vegetables as much as possible, grains, and then there's some nuances like fermented food is kind of you'll hear pros for it and cons against it for Candida. I usually let the person decide. So if they eat it and they feel worse, don't do it. If they eat it and they feel better or no change, then fine. No kombucha though, because there's yeast in kombucha and you don't want to fuel the problem. So yes, that's kind of the briefest explanation of a Candida diet that I can give, is really cutting out the sugar as much as possible. And then intermittent fasting, I've talked a lot about that, especially in many other presentations, but also in part 1 of this class. Intermittent fasting can be really, really effective for people that have bowel issues. Some of it's intuitive, right? You're fasting. So you're not putting anything in the digestive tract to inflame or irritate it. But from a biological process, there's kind of 2 phases that occur in the digestive tract. There's the digestive phase, and then there's also the interdigestive phase. In the digestive phase, peristalsis is enacted. So that's part of the enteric nervous system, where the musculature, right, it's propelling food from one end down to the other. In the interdigestive phase, which happens about 2 to 3 hours after a meal, so essentially, in a more fasted state, it's controlled by the migrating motor complex, which is independent of the autonomic nervous system. So the migrating motor complex will cleanse. It's this cleansing wave that moves debris, including bacteria and food byproducts, from the small intestines down to the colon. So in other words, it has this cleansing effect, and it can take up to 2 hours for the migrating motor complex activity to reach the ileum from the stomach. So fasting, intermittent fasting, looks at going a minimum of 12 hours to ideally closer to 16 hours without eating. Most of that's done overnight though. So it just prolongs, kind of when meal times are had. But otherwise, a lot of it's done overnight, which makes it a lot easier to incorporate into everyday life. Yeah.
So also too, would you since it kicks in, let's say 3 hours after a meal, right? And then it takes 2 hours to complete its job.
Yeah.
So ideally, would you want to also do mini fasts between meals of 5 hours?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Not, avoid snacking, things along those lines. Yeah. Avoid grazing. And you'll notice people with GI symptoms usually are fine with that. It affects their appetite. They whenever they eat, they bloat or they feel discomfort anyways. So a lot of the time they already are kind of on a subconscious level practicing this. They don't want to eat, but adding a consciousness to it and doing it deliberately and intently and in a therapeutic way can enhance the effects too. Yeah, good question. Eating inhibits it. So that's where you'll switch into that peristalsis motion. All right, and then to talk about supplements, we all have probably heard of the remove, reinoculate, repair, restore, the 4 R's. There's a go-to protocol for me that I use. I've talked about in a few different presentations. It's for the remove phase. This is something that I use for dysbiosis in general. So yeast, bacteria, SIBO, parasites can be a little bit different. And I'm going to talk about prescriptions also, just kind of a side note on prescriptions. I would still use this with parasites, but you might have to do more of a cyclical approach because of their life cycle patterns. Otherwise, this protocol that I use, Metagenics Candibactin AR and Metagenics Candibactin BR, 2 different products. You take 2 twice daily on an empty stomach for 30 to 45 days. If you're looking at eliminating some specific form of overgrowth, like if they came back with Klebsiella or Citrobacter or yeast, please retest. Don't just guess. Don't guess that the thing's gone, because if it comes back, then you got to start all over again. The GI effects is something I showed that is the kind of the Mac Daddy of stool testing, but you can do just a fungal culture, for example, just a yeast culture if it's candida that you're worried about. That's like $60. And you just test to see, is this candida gone or not? You can do just parasites. You can do just bacteria. If multiple things came back, then do more of a comprehensive microbiology. But nonetheless, at the end of the regimen, I strongly suggest retesting. Yeast, some people, like in the case study, for example, some people, it can take several months for that to be completely gone because of these biofilms. So it can be a really tricky process to doing it.
Would you do a retest of the hydrogen testing?
Yeah, I would. Unless if their symptoms go away pretty significantly and they stay gone for about 2 months, then not necessarily. If the symptoms, if they're kind of riding that dividing line where they're like, I'm better, but not 100%, then probably, yeah, or just keep the regimen going. Yeah, good question.
What's BID?
BID, twice daily.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. I got used to working in doctor's offices and they always wrote that. So yes, BID means twice daily.
is.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely. Which actually brings me to my next point. Yes, including some kind of a biofilm disruptor, right? So biofilm disruptors, two of the best ones that I know of are N-acetylcysteine, and which is also the precursor to glutathione, so you're getting a double whammy there, and proteolytic enzymes. So the one that I use, the N-acetylcysteine I use is Designs for Health, NAC, and just take that at the same time, empty stomach, as the candibactins. Or there's Interface Plus, which is produced by Clear Labs, as a proteolytic compound. That one's really great too, and use that at the same time. Gut repair. So once you can do this to some degree simultaneously at the removal phase. If not, then you'll definitely want to do it post-removal phase. And that's where it's all of your soothing, anti-inflammatory healing agents. So aloe, glutamine, marshmallow, all of those support the epithelial and the mucosal lining, help re-heal the intestines. Metagenics Ultra GI Replenish is an awesome product. It has a special form of glutamine in it that helps heal the lining. It also has special forms of prebiotics to encourage the growth of good bacteria at the expense of bad. Colostrum can be really effective in this protocol too, because it basically supplies exogenous immunoglobulins. The digestive support, you'll actually want to do both in removal and the gut repair phase, because supporting hydrochloric acid, digestive enzymes, all of the issues in those realms are what allowed this problem, often what allowed this problem to begin in the first place. So effectively breaking down your food will help starve the bacteria, right? Just kind of unraveling the ball of yarn, if you will. So I definitely do that during the removal phase also. Yeah, there's two. I usually gravitate towards Designs for Health Digestzyme or Karuna Labs Duozyme, Duozyme, I think. They're essentially the same thing, but I like them because it's a broad spectrum digestive enzyme, but it also has a little bit of bile and also has a little bit of betaine. So it has kind of everything in one. Sometimes I'll have them do vinegar or bitters at the same time, or if they need extra support, then do that too, but kind of a more comprehensive than just the enzymes. Okay, and then I include mind, body, and visualization in here too. This is for exactly the reasons I just gave. A lot of people will form dysfunctional relationships with food and a dysfunctional relationship with the healing process. This goes for any kind of chronic disease, but especially if there's digestive symptoms. A lot of people are frankly fearful of food, right? And they don't know when they eat something, if they're going to get a reaction. Sometimes it causes a reaction, sometimes the food doesn't. And so they kind of paint themselves into a box and they're only eating certain foods that are safe. So that, and people are kind of skeptical or don't trust or have a whole lot of hope in the healing process sometimes. So the mind is the most powerful aspect of all healing. Take the placebo effect, right? I mean, the placebo effect is powerful and it can go both ways. You've got the placebo and you've got the nocebo. So if they don't actually believe in what they're doing and believe in their ability to heal, they won't. So working on the mind is a really big component of that. I just came out with a workshop because I never had enough time in my appointments to talk to people about this. So I came out with a 4-week workshop on the mind-body connection, looking at subconscious programming and basically, mindfulness, meditation, and how to get your mind to work for you and not against you. But just keep in mind that that's always going to be a component of this, right? So what I do is I have people intentionally visualize, shift their energetic state and intentionally visualize what their optimal health looks like. Where are we trying to go? And shift their energy to the point where they really believe in what they're doing and and everything that they're eating. And sometimes I'll have them do intentional exercises around food. So holding certain foods and kind of changing their subconscious response to it too. So that's for a whole other class, but it's such an important component that I wanted to at least include that here. Okay. All right. I know it's 1:45. Do you guys want to briefly go over the case study? Okay. All right. So case study, 25-year-old female presents with chronic constipation that's been going on for years. Brain fog. Now the brain fog, the insomnia, and the weight gain were all more recent when I started working with her. So long history of constipation. These other issues were more recent. She had just completed a rafting trip down the Grand Canyon as well. Rafting trip, it was several weeks long. You know, you're exposed to water is very simply put what happened. So this was her stool test when it was run. And as you can see, there's a parasitic infection. Inflammation was fine for the in digestion, but she also had 2 forms of candida, and beta-glucuronidase was high. Beta-glucuronidase does several things, but it is an enzyme that essentially cleaves. Okay, one of the routes for detoxification in the liver is glucuronidation, in which it's bound to a protein. The toxin is bound to a protein and eliminated in the bile, and then completely eliminated via the feces. Beta-glucuronidase is an enzyme that cleaves the toxin from the protein carrier and allows it to be reabsorbed. So it's produced by gut bacteria, but if you see high levels of beta-glucuronidase, think toxic, right? They're probably recycling their toxins. For one, calcium D-glucarate is what you can take, that's that protein that it's bound to. So you can take that supplementally to offset it, or you can eat a lot of cruciferous vegetables. If beta-glucuronidase, just clinical side note, if it's really high, like in the thousands, that can be indicative of like colon cancer or an actual pathology. If it's subclinically high, then usually it's just a gut dysbiosis end marker. Okay, as you can see here too, in the relative abundance, I mean, she's got like no bacteria, right? The patient results as compared to the healthy cohort are very low. Ironically, she's been taking probiotics for years, which is something that we'll often see anyways. They're not adhering. And the diversity association is very low too. So this next page goes into the commensal bacteria breakdown. Several are low, but a lot of them are kind of mid-range. This third page gets into, this is a culture. This is a result of a culture. So that's where we can see the elevated levels of candida also. 2 different forms, as I mentioned before. And one side note on this, under the bacteriology, if you guys are looking at that top part, the lactobacillus that came up, no growth, don't let that throw you off. The previous page is measured by PCR technology. It's DNA technology. It's the most sensitive technology available at this point. There's lacto present. This page is looking at culturing. So Petri dish, allowing these bacteria and different microbes to actually grow. All 3 of those are facultative anaerobes, so they can only grow in an oxygen-deprived environment, which you can probably deduce is really hard to do. So if they don't grow here, it's not that big of a deal. It just means that the lab couldn't get them to grow. Now, if you see it here and no growth on the DNA side, then they don't really have lacto or whatever it is. But keep that in mind. Don't let that throw you off if you ever interpret these tests that way. Okay. So here is where we see the blastocystis that came back mini. Interesting with this too, talking about parasitic testing. This person was passing worms, but it didn't come back here. So goes to, this was a 1-day sample. So it goes back to the sensitivity of parasite testing and the importance of at least collecting many, and then even then sometimes, you know, depending on where it is in the life cycle, it might not necessarily come up. The cool thing about this test, this lab, and a lot of labs do this, it's not just Genova, is they actually, when they have those microbes in a Petri dish, they actually test therapeutic agents against it. So both pharmaceutical and natural. So you can see, I mean, in this case, fascinatingly, the yeast was resistant to fluconazole and the azoles, right? The most commonly used antifungals wouldn't have worked. But caprylic acid, uva ursi, those were very effective. So in other words, the lab is saying the natural route is going to be more effective in this case. This is where, you know, I said there would be a side note on prescriptive agents. It's very common for, you know, holistic practitioners to be completely anti-pharmaceuticals. Keep in mind, though, sometimes that when they're used appropriately, prescriptive agents can be really helpful and really effective. So in this case, actually, this girl went through the natural route, and there was some improvement, but not completely, and that went on for months. It wasn't, I mean, rashes, whole 9 yards. It wasn't until fluconazole was taken that there was a significant improvement. So interestingly, we ran a follow-up test. That test, the Candida krusei, did not come back. The albicans was still there, and fluconazole was sensitive. So kind of interesting how it morphed. But nonetheless, I mentioned that, and especially for parasite testing, or parasites, sometimes prescriptive agents can, you know, let's get in and get out. I'm not saying if they've got, you know, an overgrowth of Klebsiella, let's just hit them with antibiotics. That will have a more global impact than like an antifungal will or an antiparasitic. So you don't always want to just run to a prescription, but I'm just encouraging to not completely judge them either. Sometimes, like I said, you just want to get in and get out and then rehabilitate accordingly. Especially there have been times where I run this test and the natural agents are all kind of on the lower side as far as efficacy goes, but the prescriptive are all sensitive. And it's like, you know, come on, let's not put the person through this for 6 months when we could take a 2-week pharmaceutical. So that's my opinion, though, and obviously we'll never be prescribing anything. So working with a doctor that will and can work with you on this, and then you're supporting all of the underlying mechanisms. Combine it with a biofilm disruptor, support digestion overall, heal the lining. There's so much that food and natural approaches can do too. All right, and that covers it. So with this person, I should say with the case study, it went on for a while because it started with the natural approach, then went to the pharmaceutical. But over the course of about 6 months with follow-up testing, we finally got negative readings and the bowel movements were improving and she actually started losing weight. The brain fog went away. So everything started to improve. But it did take a very intentional approach and kind of a combination approach too. All right, and that is it, guys.